Good morning. I hope everybody's enjoying the conference. Welcome to the Transforming Metadata session here today. My name is Rachel Frick. I'll be serving as your moderator and facilitator, but the real stars of the show are our panelists that we have here today. So starting from my far side, all the way down, we have Melissa James, who is the Metadata Manager for Central Michigan University. Next to her is Tina Liu, who's the Indigenous Metadata and Engagement Assistant at the University of Toronto. Followed by Melanie Wacker, who's the Metadata Coordinator at Columbia University. And then last but not least, my colleague Ann Washington, who is a Product Analyst at OCLC. So today, this session is not going to be a whole bunch of presentations. I'm going to give a few comments here at the beginning to kind of set context. And then we're going to turn it over to our panelists to share their thoughts, ideas, and dreams and aspirations going forward around the idea of next generation metadata. So metadata work is undoubtedly now an area of transformation and transition. Some of you may know the Karen Smith Yoshimura Transitioning to the Next Generation Metadata report that was published in 2020, where she synthesized and summarized key strategic metadata considerations that the OCLC Research Library Partnership Metadata Managers Focus Group identified and worked through together from the period of 2015 to 2020, including the transition to linked data and identifiers, describing inside-out and facilitated collections, the evolution of metadata as a service, and probably most importantly, how the field is preparing for future staffing requirements in this new era of metadata. This report is both summative and foundational because it persists as a base to which we can return for articulation of metadata problems and opportunity spaces, and from which we can refine and expand upon the considerations it surfaced. At OCLC, we continue to use this framework to track and discuss these trends with stakeholders. These conversations can manifest as OCLC research publications. The most recent one was the Reimagined Descriptive Workflows report that dealt with reparative and inclusive metadata. This also informs technical explorations as well as OCLC services, like the exciting release of the 150 million person and work entities under the WorldCount Entities Project. These next generation metadata considerations can serve as a useful framework, as we hear from our panelists today, about their preparations for a linked data future, how they are pivoting metadata services to engage collaborators in metadata use beyond cataloging and metadata departments, and how they are growing and adapting skill sets for the future. When we use this term next generation metadata, in part we're talking about metadata that is marked by recent and ongoing technological and social currents, such as the advent of the semantic web and the increasing ubiquity of data in our lives. Metadata is dynamic. Like software, it is never done, and it is a product of systems of knowledge organizations that are themselves dynamic and socially negotiated. Reparative and inclusive approaches to descriptive metadata is very much part of this concept of next generation metadata. And the opportunities afforded by next generation metadata require that we adapt core traditional cataloging metadata skills and services to make the most of our investments in descriptive and contextualizing practice to best reflect and support needs in finding resources, making those resources make sense in a broader and richer context, and potentially use metadata as fodder for other work. I'd like to hand it now over to our panelists who will offer perspectives on how metadata work is transforming. And following their brief remarks, we have some prompt questions that will hopefully yield some really positive discussion. So with that, I'm going to let Melissa James kick it off.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm so glad to be here with you today. So I'm primarily here to talk about challenges. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about where I'm from so you can understand challenges. So I'm from Michigan. We show where we're from by pointing at our hands. Central Michigan University is right here in the middle of the mitten. Sorry for using that finger. In Mount Pleasant. Mount Pleasant is a rural community which is primarily known for our university and also for the Saginaw Chippewa tribe and their casino. We are a Carnegie R2 university, which makes our library a medium-sized academic. Like all Michigan universities and many across the country right now, we've faced a significant decrease in enrollment the last several years, and because of that, resources across the university are a significant challenge. We have lost staff positions and hours due to reductions and attrition. We have a very small technical services shop, and I'm a metadata subunit of one, basically, even though I do have some support. So I've spent the last 5 years learning everything I can about linked data and working toward developing a project. But so far, I've gotten some library staff operations group to approve that I can turn on the Alma linked data integration job. And that's as far as I've gotten. Really haven't been able to make linked data a reality due to the lack of resources on our end and the immaturity of the technology. But slowly, thanks to hard work of many individuals and institutions, including OCLC research, I am seeing the continued development of linked data technologies. In fact, we've had a big step forward with the release of the Shared Entities Management infrastructure. I'm proud to say that I was on the advisory group for that. It was a very enjoyable experience. So 2 areas in which I'm hoping to implement linked data projects in the near future are integrating entities workflows into our local authorities work. We do a lot with local authorities. I'll talk more about that. And using linked data to implement alternative thesauri into our record remediation work. And for that, I'm going to stop now so we can get on with our conversation.
Hi, I'm Tina Liu. I am the Indigenous Metadata and Engagement Assistant at the University of Toronto Libraries. So I am currently a student. I will be graduating in November of this year. And so as a student, I'm coming into this from the perspective of a very new professional. And so I'll be speaking primarily about linked open data. Can you speak up, please? Oh, I'm so sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay, I'll be speaking primarily about Wikidata because that is where the University of Toronto has chosen to focus their linked open data priorities. In general, this work kind of started in 2019 with the launch of the PCC Wikidata pilot, but it was interrupted by the pandemic, as many things were, and further kind of brushed aside because in 2021, the University of Toronto decided to upgrade their metadata system, their LSP, from CRC Dynex to Alma. And part of the conversations that we had were very much, how do we use Wikidata to kind of supplement and help make discoverable items in the University of Toronto's archives? And one of the big challenges that we continued to run into was we couldn't come up with a concrete workflow. We came to this with the approach of a trainer-to-trainer approach, which kind of decentralized power, which works very well in the Wikidata environment because the idea is that the low bar of entry allows everyone to participate and contribute. But then the problem with that is we had a very hard time coming up with a concrete project because no one could really agree on it. So for the time being, we have since put that on hold as we kind of recalibrate how we want to go about things. The U of T has primarily done this work through an open technology specialist, Alex Jung, and he is the primary Wikidata person. So most of our Wikidata work has been in the context of editathons because editathons are a very clear and easy topic for us to kind of center our energy and concentration around. So with that, I will pass this on to Melody.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? All right. And I'm trying to not let my glasses fog too much. So first of all, I want to thank our colleagues from OCLC Research for putting this panel together and inviting us to speak. So I was asked to focus my remarks on metadata as a service, and thinking about that, first of all, what kind of services and for whom exactly. So in my mind, there are two aspects really. One is using the metadata to support new types of service, such as metrics, evaluating, collection development, or purchase decisions and such. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, services that we provide as the metadata staff, such as consultation and training to colleagues outside the metadata unit, so reference staff or curators, for instance, or outside the libraries altogether, researchers, faculty, or students. And quite a few years ago, my division was asked to develop a framework at Columbia. We were asked to develop a framework for research metadata support. And we did, and it was generally well received. We planned on working with researchers to develop metadata strategies, offer advice on taxonomy development, analyze the existing metadata, or provide one-on-one or group training. However, this was never actually implemented just because of bandwidth issues. It takes quite a bit of staff to really support that adequately. However, even though we never really advertised it, we are actually, in fact, providing these services right now, either to staff within the libraries or outside the libraries. And this may involve helping to develop a data dictionary or metadata application profile and advice on related topics like authority control and identity management, or on use of tools like OpenRefine. For digital library projects, so for internal non-MAC work, basically, we are now written into the application process. So technically, nobody's supposed to get past the metadata division. And this is of critical importance to us when the metadata that's initiated by curators or reference staff is supposed to end up within our systems, and our systems have to be able to ingest it and also display it. And so we will then analyze the existing metadata, because there's almost always some existing data around. We advise on the next steps that have to be taken to make data work within desired systems. And we also let them know what the estimated effort will be to complete this. We also advise on strategies to expose metadata in multiple places. And this all works fairly well as long as existing workflows are being followed. But every now and then, we will be brought in late in the process, particularly, for instance, when an external partner writes a grant application involving library application. So through word of mouth, faculty sometimes do get in touch with us and ask to guest teach a session in their course, focusing on metadata, particularly when their students, as part of the coursework, have to put together a digital humanities project. And that's one of the more enjoyable parts of the process, because of the interesting questions and points of view that come from the students. However, to do this on a larger scale, we need the appropriate staffing level. But altogether, metadata as a service has definitely become already a big component of our everyday work. And personally, with an eye on Columbia University Library's strategic directions, I only see that expanding in the future.
So in order to progress this transformation of metadata and knowledge work, having that infrastructure at scale is really a key component. So we're excited to announce that we've completed the project that was funded in part by the Mellon Foundation to develop this shared entity infrastructure that supports linked data initiatives in the library community. So as a result of this, as Rachel mentioned, we've released millions of authoritative WorldCat entities through a publicly searchable website, and we'll continue to partner with libraries to develop the tools needed to fully incorporate linked data into their workflows and improve resource discovery through those connections. A really exciting part of the project was working closely with an advisory group. So thanks, Melissa, for joining us today and all of our panelists. And that had representation across different library types, sizes, and location. And through the engagement with this group, the OCLC team gained insights on user needs. We got feedback on data models, the user interface, and perspectives on workflows that this system could support. And we did that through regular meetings, focus groups, and testing opportunities. So it was through the work with this group that we were able to release WorldCat entities, and they're freely available through our lookup website for anyone to explore at entities.oclc.org. And they all have unique URI that can be, that's permanent, and we intend to maintain. So it's really exciting to get all these identifiers at scale out into the world. So you can already look those up, add them to your metadata, and see how they can make new connections possible. So this WorldCat entities is just the beginning. It forms an initial foundation and infrastructure which will allow libraries, OCLC, and other stakeholders to jointly curate metadata. And we're now partnering with some key libraries to help us refine and enhance entities management tool, again, kind of to help create that shared entity ecosystem called OCLC Meridian, and some APIs to give libraries what they need to fully incorporate linked data into their workflows. All with the aim of empowering discovery through connections that answer questions that researchers and users haven't even thought to ask. So we're really looking forward to continuing to work with you all and the community so we can innovate together.
Thanks, Anne. Anne reminded me that we met a long time ago. I was trying to remember when that was, at a Linked Open Data for Libraries, Archives, and Museums Summit in Australia. So it's really nice to have a colleague working in this area that's been involved with linked data for quite a long time. So now we're getting to the fun part, the discussion prompts. So I would say follow along, maybe think of an answer for yourself, but I'm going to turn off and kick off with this first question for our panelists. What is the primary challenge you are confronting in transitioning to this new linked data and identifier-informed workflows?
Yeah, this is an easy one for me to answer. Lack of resources, like I mentioned, staff and time to do the work, but also lack of knowledge because everyone is so pressed for time, and we always say everybody's doing a job and a half in our library. Nobody really has time to learn this, and there's a bit of a learning curve to learning about linked data and what it is and how it works, and so a big part of my challenge regarding linked data is just educating the staff and administration about linked data. I talk a lot about the value of linked data. Why do we care? Why do we want it? Where's the profession going in transitioning away from legacy metadata? Where are we at? We're moving at a snail's pace, but we're moving. I also have to fight a little bit of misinformation because there are some people that think that linked data is only for big guys, meaning big R1 research institutions. So I have to also prove to them the applicability of linked data for all types and sizes of libraries. So yeah, those are the challenges that I deal with.
Great. And I just want to remind our panelists, because of our masks, really get that microphone close to your mouth.
Okay. As a student, most of my approach to this is very observational. And I think culture shifts are really hard because resistance comes from people being apprehensive about technological change. And so in our Wikidata working group, it's more or less the same people who are primarily new librarians and or technology specialists and students who regularly show up, as opposed to tenured librarians who have other competing priorities. And it's a lot easier, I find, for me as a very young and new professional to latch onto Wikidata and linked open technologies as a whole, because this is technology that I'm coming into versus already having set habits and preferences for other technologies and ways of doing things. So the train-to-trainer approach that we use to shared learning and open pedagogy is helpful for me because it is a way for me to learn and teach others while learning myself. But it's much less helpful for tenured librarians because of all those competing librarians. Another difficulty is designing a concrete workflow to design a project around. For example, we attempted to create a buildings profile modeled on the University of Washington's buildings, but we ran into issues with data dependencies, and that project has since stalled. So while I think it's important for new professionals to have concrete projects to work on, which we have successfully had one through an archives ads project, a big part of it is just understanding how to develop projects. And Wikidata is most useful, I find, as a springboard for understanding RDA and the many things that you have to take into consideration when creating metadata.
So in my mind, there are two things that come to mind in terms of challenges. One is, of course, systems, which has been mentioned earlier. Many of these existing systems still are unable to use linked data or take advantage of the identifiers within it, even though, luckily, by now there are a few examples out there that we can point to, and which is a big step forward. But nevertheless, many IT departments are just simply stretched so thin that when we tell them, and now we want to move to linked data, that's a really hard sell. We do at Columbia have a homegrown non-mark metadata editor called Hyacinth that is identifier informed, meaning it uses URIs instead of the text strings to manage the data. And I'm saying identifier informed instead of linked data because it doesn't actually output RDF, so it's not actually linked data. And it's great, but it's under the hood, so a lot of our colleagues outside the technology and metadata units don't really understand what it does or why that is such a big deal to us. In terms of discovery system that also mostly still operate on text string, that means we are still stuck on certain sources of authorities, for example, for agency LCNAV. And don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of the LCNAV. But if we really need identifiers for the majority of our entities, then we just need to include other approaches that scale easier. And the second aspect is the data quality. Many of us are dealing with lower and lower staffing levels, so the metadata is created by vendors, it's being outsourced, or it's cataloging on receipt. And that means that the exact elements that would help us move our data better into linked data more easily are the ones that are not being created, such as authorities, which means we have even fewer identifiers available, or relationships elements, because that's often not considered core description. It's also more complicated to train for.
Great, thanks. Anthony, you have anything else to add?
Sure. I mean, I think y'all have brought up really great points. And something that came to my mind just based on some of the projects that we've been engaged in and research is scale, infrastructure, tools. And so we're hoping, that we know that WorldCat entity is a first step in that. But it's something that we definitely keep in mind. I'll maybe start with Melanie.
We'll start with Melanie next time for this question. Hold on to the mic. So what are those significant opportunities you're seeing establishing and describing entities to provide some context for acquired published collections materials, as well as archives, special collections, and then those different types of scholarly outputs that are not a traditional publication?
So to me, the biggest benefit to establishing different entities such as authors, corporate bodies, concepts, or events in a linked data format is to connect entities that appear across all of these format types. I always keep thinking back about that a few years back when we were working to develop the art and rare materials extension for BibFrame. What we noticed was that we may have a portrait of a person in the art collection and his letters in the archives and the published works in the stacks and the oral history in the oral history collection. So the biggest advantage to me is, to either create those identifiers or connect them if they're established by different communities, so that our patrons can find the resources connecting to the same entity. It doesn't matter which format type it is or where it is located. Scholarly research output tends to hang a little bit out there because it tends to be more recent. However, we had a recent project where we realized that we think about it that way, but it's not always that way. We surfaced a gray literature collection through the institutional repository portal. But it was also important to surface it through the catalog, through OCLC, through Trust and Internet Archive, all using the same metadata and the same identifiers. So greater use of ORCIDs will help for institutional repositories. So it helps to bridge silos.
Yeah.
One of the biggest opportunities I see is just in how library school students are now learning about and creating Wikidata in courses, which shows that this work is gaining traction. For example, at the University of Toronto, Dr. Stacey Allison Casson now teaches a course on Wikidata, and the main project in that course is to choose a topic and create at least 5 Wikidata entities in relation to that topic. And I think the low bar of entry is really helpful in allowing marginalized communities to create their own data instead of others creating data for them, because it allows people to describe material in ways that make sense for their own communities, rather than having labels ascribed to them. For me, in my project in Dr. Stacey Allison Casson's class, it was on Chinese Canadian authors. And so I created Wikidata to contribute to a linked open database for others to really draw on, because search engines use a lot of Wikidata to help improve discovery. So Wikidata provides another path for archives and special collections to be findable for users. Another example would be our Archives app project, which involved adding the P496 Archives app property in Wikidata to individuals whose archives could be found in the University of Toronto's Discover archives. So I think there are a lot of opportunities for helping elevate marginalized voices, as well as in making traditional analog archives more accessible to a general public.
Thanks.
So the thing that I'm most excited about changing with entities that we're doing right now is just changing the way we do our local authorities' workflows and processes, and just moving that into an entity's workflow, because I manage the metadata for the university library. We also have the Clark Historical Library, which is a special collections and archives. And we have an archivist and a cataloger, but none of the 3 of us do cataloging full-time, and none of us are NACO members. And so when we need to create something, like I manage the theses and dissertations that get into the institutional repository, and then our archivist does all kinds of name and place, entities, because we have all these local things that are relative to Central Michigan University or Isabella County, or things that are really very local and regional. And so anyway, I'm very excited to transition that work into more of an entities workflow and an entities system, because then it's reusable, it's shareable, we have URIs. I have to sell those folks on that this is what we want to do. But I'm very excited to transition that work and make it more standardized and less siloed in just our institution. So
I'm going to ask you a follow-up question. So when you, at the very beginning, how many people are on your metadata staff, Melissa? How many folks do you have in your metadata unit?
Okay, in the university library, I am the metadata unit. Each subunit of our technical services is basically one person. And then we have the historical library that has an archivist, a digital management archivist person, a cataloger, but she also has liaison responsibilities. I mean, basically everything that you would consider a subunit is headed up by like one person. And then we have student employees to help us.
The reason why I was asking is just like, how did you argue to, if you only have one and then you're doing entity work, how are you allowed to do entity work as opposed to just like, instead of basic cataloging? How are you able to kind of elevate or transition what maybe people might expect what your cataloging folks are supposed to be doing?
We have automated a lot of our workflows. In Elma, with OCLC collections, with vendor metadata.
Yeah.
So that we don't do, other than the archivist and the special collections primary resources, we don't do cataloging. We don't do original cataloging. I do very little, only when something comes through our door that is unique to us, very little original cataloging. I do batch processing of metadata.
I didn't mean to put you on the spot. That was a totally, impromptu question. Thank you.
That's okay, no problem.
So I think this is one of our other questions about conceiving or deploying metadata as a service. We talked a little bit about that, and I know Melanie talked a little bit about it. But what organizational or community adjacencies or collaborations are needed in supporting emerging metadata services? So I guess it's a little bit from that last little question there.
So we don't have a lot of plans for the future. We have done a lot with metrics. Over the last 5 or 6 years, we have done a lot with collection management because we have done some massive print monograph withdrawals and some rolling print serials withdrawals as we've shifted to electronic resources.
Yeah.
And we had a master plan of our building done to shift our space. And so we withdrew a whole bunch of print resources that we had online and have repurposed the space for student study space, basically. And so metrics was huge. For future applications, my big hope, this academic year, we started doing reparative cataloging work. Me and my two cataloging colleagues. And so I really want to deploy linked data to apply alternative vocabularies for that work. And I could even, we've presented on our reparative work a couple times and had some really interesting feedback and interest in our work. And so I could even conceive of doing some consulting with other libraries and working together with other libraries on that as well. So
great. I was going to say, if you have anything or if you want to pass, that's fine too.
I have I'm a manager. So the University of Toronto approached metadata as a service by restructuring their previous cataloging department. So there no longer is a cataloging department. It is now called Metadata Services, and it is headed by Mei Chan, who was brought on in part because they wanted to embrace this idea of metadata as a service. So in doing so, metadata has become more receptive to cross-department collaboration, and it has since made, I have been told that the general environment and metadata has now become a lot friendlier, and there's a lot more cross-department collaboration rather than just catalogers sitting in their silos and just doing their own thing without very much collaboration, especially in relation to work related to offensive subject headings, where cross-departmental and community engagement is really important. This revamping of the previous cataloging department into metadata services has been super helpful in making communities more receptive to working with metadata librarians.
Yeah, I already talked about most of it during my introduction. I just want to focus on the collaboration aspect, since we can't really, as I said earlier, university-wise advertise that we are there. We rely on unofficial networks. So, for example, a digital humanities librarian who is very good at whenever somebody, a faculty member or student asked about metadata, to send them our way. Also, being visible is very important, even within the libraries itself, because even though we are technically written into the workflow, staff changes and they don't know about us, or they just are tempted to skip that step because it seems like too much work. So we try to insert ourselves and make ourselves visible. For example, Wikidata was brought up a few times. It's a great tool to do that. So as a wrap-up for the PCC Wikidata pilot that we were also part of, we also hosted a Wikidata editathon to surface collaboratively our special collections and agents connected to it. But that turned out to be such a success that we are hoping to offer one every 6 months or so. So it's just so that people are aware who we are, that we are available to help.
Great. Andy, have anything to add? Or? No. Great. Well, this is our last question, then we'll open up for questions from our audience here. So during this time of metadata transitions, what are the critical staff skills you're looking for or are you building with the staff you have? And what training or professional development areas you see as especially important to nurture or pursue now? Go.
Well, everything. Because staff still need to have a really solid background in library cataloging rules, and just in my humble opinion, and they still need to understand MARC and RDA and subject analysis and the whole 9 yards. But I also need to be comfortable with non-MARC metadata and have a basic understanding of linked data and affinity for technology such as OpenRefine and so on as a basic, or working with APIs. Flexibility is king. Yes, that's a tall order, I know. But somebody who doesn't understand where we're coming from can't reuse the existing data in other environments, or would have a hard time to create new metadata that fits into this ecosystem more or less. And on the other hand, if you don't have any concept of linked data, then you're tempted to drop exactly, as I said earlier, the aspects that we really need to move forward. But we don't, the problem, of course, is if you would write that into a job description, you would have a minimal amount of applicants. So we don't expect people to come with that.
Yeah.
Rather to have, the traditional attention to detail, but also an aptitude to work with emerging technologies, and then we train. We had really good experience recently with recent library school graduates, and then we just provide the training.
Okay.
As a student, I can only speak to the skills that I know that my supervisor is trying to train into me. And my supervisor is Mei Chan, and she focuses primarily on technical and relational skills. So our participation in the PCC Wikidata pilot pushed me to become a trainer. As we followed a train-to-trainee model based on the carpentries, this forced me to develop comfort and learn how to become a facilitator, and also break down educational steps that I took in order to learn how to create Wikidata and how to create good Wikidata. So other skills that I've been developing are computational abilities and pattern recognition, which I've been told overlaps a lot with what traditional metadata catalogers also need, because this helps me understand and navigate better uses for web content and access those tools and workflows from a metadata perspective. Great.
Like Melanie said, I would just really like someone in my institution that has a true understanding of basic linked data concepts. It's such a learning curve, like I said, that it's so, nobody has the time to really study it and learn it. Also, really following the trends and what is happening and understanding, the players in the game and who's doing what, I think is important. I think it's also important to have an understanding of basic, what I think of as old school cataloging principles, but also be able to have some ability to work with data transformation tools. MarcEdit is vital, in my opinion, because in my world, we have to be able to do these bigger projects. I have to automate everything in the day-to-day. And so to be able to do that, I have to be able to fix up the records with MarcEdit, or be able to work with big data in Excel sheets or OpenRefine, or so having at least a basic aptitude for those types of tools and utilities, I think or at least be able to have an aptitude to learn them, is also very, very important.
Great. Thank you so much. That's the end of our pre-prompted questions. But now is the time for you to ask our panelists some questions that you might be having, or share what maybe your answers to some of the questions we had today. So there's one in the back. Carrie, can you run the mic? Can you do a Phil Donahue for me?
Oh, gosh.
That's an old reference.
Thank you. I'm Karen Eslin, Dean at Colorado State University, and a big fan of linked data, have done linked data for a long time. I wanted to ask a little bit about the questions you had about systems and the user experience, and Anne, you mentioned you learned some lessons through the Mellon project there. One of the things that we had found early on when I was at University of Oregon is we were actually asking our catalogers to have terrible wrist injuries by how we were having them look up linked data. And I just wondered if you could talk more about the tools, the process, and the user experience for the cataloger themselves.
Sure. So what we focused on in the project was some APIs that could sort of power different tools. So that was one kind of major emphasis to empower folks to use these APIs to create tools and work through batches and things like that. And then we found that what was really valuable to folks was, again, the what's now OCLC Meridian, or will be released later, the user interface for doing sort of like one at a time at this point, but really being able to, enter in an entity description was really valuable. So we had an emphasis on APIs, but then also found some interesting things when looking at the user interface. And one of the things that did come up is, there is this steep learning curve that folks have talked about. And so that was really top of mind as we were looking at these tools. How can we make this accessible, and could we think a little bit differently about what it looks like to create descriptive information?
My name is Ann Faust. I'm from Liberty University. I'm the cataloging librarian there. And I'm just wondering, big picture, BibFrame has been talked about, like it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. What practicality is there, if I can ask this question, in really learning the nitty-gritty of all this linked data? How does that play into BibFrame? Is it going to be all done away with once do you understand what my question is? If we're adding linked data to the MARC records, how does that translate over to BibFrame? And do you understand what I'm asking?
BibFrame? Can you answer, Melanie? And if not, I'll pass it over to Nathan.
So I assume you're referring to the URIs that are being often added to the MARC records now?
Correct.
Yes, and that just makes the transformation to BibFrame or any other linked data vocabulary a lot easier. If you're trying to match text strings, there is a lot of possibility to match the wrong entities or not find a match when there really is one. So it just gives us much cleaner data in the end.
Thank you.
Nathan, did you have anything to add to that answer?
Hello, everybody. I'm Nathan Putnam, Director of Data Quality and Governance at OCLC, and I just wanted to add to the comment about BibFrame is that our hope is that, and we know that libraries are going to be cataloging and creating entities in multiple different systems, and so you have your option to do BibFrame, you have your option to do MARC cataloging, and then with the entity infrastructure, if you want to create those URIs to play in those other environments, you have that option as well.
You have a question up here? And then we'll have a question up here.
Mark Sharf, Washington University in St. Louis. This is kind of a off-the-wall question, but it's playing off what you talked about, entities. And one of the things that I'm wondering, when I catalog, I have to revise copy that we get from YBP, and I have to do it because I have to change the call number. And what I find sometimes is that they have matched, based on a character string, they have matched somebody incorrectly in an access point. What I'm wondering is, as we move into an area where we're dealing with identifiers, what do you anticipate, and when we're in an environment where these entities, the ability to create and edit them is more widely distributed, what do you anticipate in terms of how various communities, particularly the commercial cataloging communities, might react? Are they going to be more likely to say, well, we'll look and see, make sure there's an existing entity record for this, or will they just say, it's just easier to make a new one?
Do you have perspectives on? I would love to hear.
I don't know.
Oh, you don't know.
I think that's a really good question.
Melanie, do you have anything to add?
Well, of course, the hope is that we will get more entities with identifiers from other sources, and if that is another type of vocabulary, and we can then just use services as somebody to link over here or other efficient services to link those identifiers. That would be sufficient. I don't believe that every community will have to use our identifiers or our vocabularies, but if they come with something, that would be great. But of course, remains to be seen.
Question, or I was going to mention something.
Hello, this is Iman Khairi from Qatar National Library. I am working with Arabic cataloging. Excuse me, how you can collect identifiers or bring identifiers URIs for Arabic authorities or for non-English, non-LSE authorities? How you can find the unique identifiers For example, from Wikidata or other source. What are the sources?
So thinking about, just to clarify or make sure we heard your question, what are the different sources of identifiers? Was that one of your questions? Maybe we could see what folks are using. I think some have mentioned some different tools, but want to cover some examples? Identify, like sources of identifiers, y'all?
I don't know if that's going to reach. Can you hear me? So the integration job that I'm getting ready to turn on in our system is going to populate the Library of Congress authorities id.loc.gov database URIs. And so that's going to, because we have LCSH, that's going to populate those URIs to our database, and they'll come and go with the authorities' jobs that run in our system. I think, to kind of get back to your question from a second ago, I think that we need to just really tell vendors that this is what we want, and that there are existing databases of data like that one and like the new OCLC system that they need to be using, and not just starting up their own, for sure, because that's when things get just messy. So, yeah.
We have one more question up at the front, Carrie. Go ahead.
I think that's interesting. I just wanted to mention, again, the question about maybe duplicates in the future, or, having this proliferation of identifiers. One thing that came up in I think one of our using linked data for discovery, a project for Content DM, and the description workshops was reusing data that was there. And an interesting perspective, I think that one of them that came out of the LD4 project was perhaps, will some of the knowledge work shift towards reconciliation and like emphasizing, we have the ability to sort of reason this person is different than this person. Maybe if we get a lot of that other descriptive, titles and things like that, we can focus on, or the folks doing the knowledge work, the metadata, can focus on, making those connections, because I think you mentioned one of the most important things from all of these sources of data are authorities, people, places, things like that. And so perhaps will some of the work shift to managing some of that?
Hi, I'm Beth Pignally Camden from the University of Pennsylvania, and I wanted to follow up on the question about MARC and URIs and MARC, which some people call linky MARC, and it was specifically for the OCLC folks. And the last I checked, the program that you run to connect MARC records, bibliographic records, to the authority file will wipe out any added URIs that people put in records, and such as the PCC URIs and MARC project and other libraries that are putting URIs in. Are there plans to connect the MARC database at OCLC with the entity database in a way that's usable for people that want the both linked data and MARC?
The great news is the people that can answer that question are sitting right beside you.
Yeah.
David, you want to answer? David?
I can take it. Hi, Beth. This is David White here from OCLC. One of the things that we're looking at now, and Anne is actually working on that with us, is to look at how behind the scenes we can pull together like the WorldCat entities, tie that into the bibliographic data, and give an option that then you can output the WorldCat record with the WorldCat entities data directly in it, and then also be able to get updates. So we have the WorldCat updates option that we have in Collection Manager, that as a bibliographic record changes, you can get a feed. We did an option in there that said something like, if the record changes from AACR2 to RDA, you could get it. So we're looking at like an option like entities are added to a record that I already hold, so give me another copy of it. So Anne's outlining with a couple other people on our team some options, and then we are looking at what that would take to do that, knowing that I think what Nathan mentioned is knowing that we have libraries that are going to be in the MARC-only world, there are libraries that are going to be in the linked data world, and there are going to be libraries that are in the middle. And this isn't changing overnight. We just stopped printing catalog cards a couple years ago. So we got a long way to go before everybody's going to be all the way into a linked data world. And so we're looking at all the options for all three of those. So MARC only, BibFrame only, whatever, and then the in-between.
Thank you, David. All right. Any more questions from the audience? We have time for one more question. Larry's running.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm Lauren Geiger. I'm from Mississippi State University, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit about how the linked data and the URIs could assist with cataloging and creating entities for non-English materials, non-English language materials.
Do you all have any perspectives about like specific multilingual? Have you had to approach that in some of your work? Yeah.
More and more often.
Anyone? No.
So, I mean, we really love Wikidata with all the different scripts and languages that are available and that you can change the interface and so on. But it just is a request that comes up more and more often, even our general non-MARC cataloging, to have better support for different languages and script. So working on that one. But Wikidata is one where we can really try that out, and we really like it.
Yeah, we're really excited and had an eye on that as we were working on the entities infrastructure to support, over 600 languages that you can use for a label or a translation of a work title or something like that. So that's one of the major opportunities that we have in linked data. We talked a little bit about inclusive language, but also to use scripts and things like that. So that's been key to what we're supporting with our with WorkCat entities.
If you will join me in thanking the panelists that we had here today, thank you so much.